following is the induction talk originally given by the Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw to meditators coming to Mahasi Sayadaw in Rangoon, Burma. The introduction to this talk is by Sayadaw U Pandita. As human beings, having had the great fortune to encounter the teachings of the Buddha, we should make full use of this opportunity by putting his instructions into practice. The Buddha's instructions include the trainings of morality, sila, concentration, samadhi, and wisdom, panya. We should practice to perfect all three. For monks and novices, the training of sila means keeping their monastic rules. This means avoiding doing the things which are forbidden, which are not good to do or say. If the rule says, don't do that sort of thing, then one does not do it. If the rule says, don't say that sort of thing, then one does not say it. As long as monks and novices avoid doing and saying those things which are prohibited, their action and speech are clean, and they gain polite physical and verbal behavior. This much alone is quite praiseworthy. In addition, concentration, samadhi, and wisdom, panya, can arise during practice. Lay people need to keep at least 5 precepts. The 5 precepts are refraining from killing, refraining from stealing, refraining from adultery, refraining from lying, and refraining from using drugs and intoxicants. When lay people can avoid doing these 5 things which should not be done, their actions and speech are clean, and they gain polite physical and verbal behavior. This much alone is quite praiseworthy. Also, samadhi and panya can develop during their practice. But when meditating in a permanent meditation center as now, it is better to keep 8 precepts. In the 8 precepts, the rule about adultery, kamesu michikara, is removed from the 5 precepts and replaced by the rule about celibacy, a brahmacharya. Kamesu michikara means refraining from adultery or sexual relations with someone who is not your spouse. A brahmacharya means observing celibacy, which includes refraining from sexual relations even with your own spouse. It is a higher training. The additional 3 precepts are refraining from eating after 12 noon, refraining from dancing, singing, playing musical instruments, and other forms of entertainment, beautification and adornment, and refraining from sitting or sleeping on high and luxurious beds. Adding these 3 make 8. Upasita sila is made up of these 8 rules. Keeping this moral code, sila, without breaking or weakening it, makes one's actions and speech even more pure. One gains more refined physical and verbal behavior. This is even more praiseworthy. But one's mental outlook and knowledge won't be any different only by keeping morality, sila. They will be unchanged. Therefore, in order to develop one's mind and knowledge, one needs to practice satipatthana meditation, as you are doing now. Because of this practice, the mind will expand and knowledge will develop stage by stage, starting from the basics. Ultimately, knowledge will ripen and mature. One will come to know the peace and happiness of the ending of all arising and passing away directly with the knowledge of noble path and fruition. Then, as a human being, one will have gained the benefit of meeting with the great teachings of the Buddha. For gaining this sort of benefit, our endless benefactor, the late Most Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw, taught the practical method of satipatthana. He gave instructions for how yogis, whether keeping the sila of a monk, a nun, or a layperson, should work in order to cultivate the mind and develop knowledge. Yogis just need to listen respectfully to these instructions and then try to apply them to develop knowledge. The following are the instructions. The work of vipassana means that one has to make effort to know the mind and matter that are present in one's body as they really are. Matter or rupa are things which can be seen right now. The whole body which we can see now is just a conglomeration or a collection of matter. Mind or Nama is consciousness, or the mind which knows. This mind and matter, or mental and physical phenomena, are clearly there every time something is seen. Therefore, to know mind and matter as they really are, one has to note and observe seeing, every time seeing occurs. To note and observe means to pay attention, focusing with knowledge so as to know for sure. In the same way, one has to note hearing, every time the ear hears. One has to note smelling, every time an odor is smelled by the nose. Every time a taste is known by the tongue, one must note tasting. Every time something is touched by the body, one must note touching. And one must note fantasizing, thinking, and planning every time there is fantasizing, thinking, or planning. But at the start, one can't yet keep up with and observe every seeing and hearing, touching and knowing, so as to know them all. Therefore, one has to note, starting with things which are obvious and easy to know. With every in-breath and out-breath, as the belly or abdomen inflates and deflates, stiffness, tension, and movement become evident. This is the physical quality called the air element, or Vayu Dhatu. We start by observing this. In order to observe it, we have to watch the abdomen with our mind. When air comes in, you will find that the abdomen rises or expands. When the air goes out, you will find the abdomen falls back down. Observe the rising as rising, the falling as falling. If it isn't obvious, just by watching intently with the mind, place the hand on the abdomen. Don't adjust the breathing. Don't hold the breath to make it slow. Don't try to make it fast. Don't breathe forcefully either. If you control the breath, you'll get tired. Therefore, just breathe normally. If the breathing becomes irregular, just allow the next breath to come naturally as usual. While breathing in normally like this, note the rising as rising. Note the falling as falling. Rising and falling are just said in the mind. It is not necessary to say the words aloud. To observe with vipassana, the names or labels one uses are not the main thing. It is more important to know. Therefore, the task isn't finished just by labeling the object. When noting rising, one should come to know the expansion, the rising movement, definitely, from the beginning of the rising until the end, as though seeing it with one's own eyes. When noting the falling, one should come to know the falling clearly as though seeing it with one's very own eyes. When you note rising, the knowing should stay with the rising. Just as you aim when throwing a stone so that it hits the target, you must take care when noting so that the mind catches or meets the arising object of observation precisely. When noting the falling too, it's just the same. The observation should meet the falling precisely. When there's nothing special to note, just note these two objects, rising and falling. You should keep on noting, without a break, rising, falling, rising, falling. While observing like this, the mind may go somewhere else. You must also observe the mind that wanders in this way. Note the mind as wandering. When noted like this once or twice, it may stop wandering. Then return to observing and noting, rising, falling. If the mind goes somewhere, note, going. Then return to observing, rising, falling. If in your imagination you meet someone, note, meeting. Then return to observing, rising, falling. Sometimes one only regains one's awareness after one imagines meeting someone and is speaking to him or her. Note this imaginary speech as speaking, speaking. In brief, whatever happens, every time there is imagining or thinking, just note and observe it. As for how to note it, when imagining, note imagining, imagining. When thinking, note thinking, thinking. When planning, note planning, planning. When you realize something, note realizing, realizing. When reflecting, note reflecting, reflecting. If you feel happy, note happy, happy. When bored, note bored, bored. When glad, note glad, glad. When depressed, note depressed, depressed. What is this observation of knowing, of thinking, imagination, and other acts of consciousness every time they occur? It is called Citta Nupassana. Because people are not able to observe and know the mind or consciousness in this way each time it occurs, people think the mind is a person, a being. Imagination is I. People think, I am reflecting, I am thinking, I am knowing. They think, from the time of childhood up until now, for this whole lifetime, there really is an I that lives and knows. But in fact, there is no such I. There is only consciousness occurring one after another continuously. We have to observe consciousness occurring every moment without a break in order to know it directly for ourselves. Therefore, we must note consciousness every time it arises. When observed, consciousness tends to disappear. If one notes thinking, thinking one or two times, the thought isn't there anymore. It disappears. We then return to observing rising, falling, falling. After sitting for a while, aching and heat tend to arise in the body. We must observe these too. When aching, note aching, aching, focusing the mind carefully on the ache in order to know it. When hot, note hot, hot. When there is pain, note pain, pain. When tired, too, just note tired, tired. These aches, heat, pains, weariness, and discomfort are unpleasant feelings called dukkha vedana in Pali. Observing these is called contemplation of feeling, or Vedana Nupassana. Because of not being able to observe and know these sensations every time they arise, people think the aches, heat, pain, numbness, and discomfort are I. I ache. I'm hot. I am in pain. They think in terms of a self, a being. They think in terms of an individual. Before I was all right, now I'm uncomfortable. In fact, it is not like this. Because of unpleasant contact occurring in one's body, one moment after another, uncomfortable feelings occur anew, one after another. It's just like an electric lamp, which stays lit continuously when electricity flows because new electrical impulses are coming again and again. In the body, because of experiencing unpleasant contacts one after another, uncomfortable feelings arise one after another without a break. If there is aching, note aching, aching. If there is heat, note heat, heat. If it hurts, note pain, pain. These must be observed, focusing carefully in this way in order to know them. When one begins to observe them, the aches, heat, and pain tend to increase. When this happens, the desire to change position tends to arise. One must observe this desire as wanting to change, then returning to observing the heat or ache. It is said that if one can be patient, one will reach Nibbana. This means that patience is more useful in meditation practice than in other areas. One can only practice meditation if one is patient. If one can't endure aches or heat, but adjusts one's position often during meditation, good concentration, samadhi, will not arise. If concentration doesn't arise, knowledge won't arise, and one won't gain path, fruition, or nibbana, liberation. Therefore, one must be patient and continue observing. Being patient in meditation practice means, for the most part, that one must endure unpleasant feelings or dukkha vedana in one's body. Therefore, if aches, heat, pain, or discomfort arise, one must not suddenly stop one's observation and shift or adjust. One must continue to patiently observe aching, heat, and so on. When one can observe patiently like this, ordinary pains, vedana, will disappear. But when knowledge based on concentration becomes strong, one will see that even intense, huge pains go away. When they go away like this, just return to observing the rising and falling. If after some time of noting it, the pain doesn't go away, but becomes unbearable, then one must change one's position. But you must start by observing the desire to change the posture as wanting to change. When raising the hand, note raising. When moving it, note moving. One has to move slowly and observe every movement carefully in order like this: lifting, moving, touching. When the body sways, note swaying. When lifting up the leg, note lifting. When moving it, note moving. When putting it down, note putting down. When there is no more adjustment and the body is still, again return to the observing rising, falling. You should not stop your observation in between. One noting should follow another one immediately. Only when the preceding moment of concentration and the succeeding moment of concentration, the preceding moment of knowing and the succeeding moment become continuous, will mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom, sati, samadhi, and panya, increase and mature bit by bit. When they become mature and full strength in this way, then one will reach path knowledge. It is said that practicing meditation means working like a person trying to start a fire with 2 sticks. In the olden days, before there were matches, people had to rub 2 sticks together to start a fire. A person had to keep on rubbing the sticks together without stopping until there was a spark. As the sticks got hotter and hotter, the person had to keep on applying effort and rubbing. Because of rubbing continuously like this, not only did it get very hot, but fire would start. At that point, the person could rest. In just that way, one must continue observing without a break, so that the preceding observation and the succeeding observation, the preceding concentration and the succeeding concentration become continuous. Therefore, after finishing observing aching or heat, don't stop. One must observe rising, falling, without a break in between. While noting like this, if some place starts to itch, one has to note that too. Focus on the place that itches and note itchy. This too is an uncomfortable feeling, dukkha vedana. If the desire arises to make the itch go away, observe this consciousness as wanting to scratch. One shouldn't scratch it yet. One must then return to noting itchy. When observing like that, in most cases the itch goes away. When it goes away, simply return to observing rising, falling. If the itch doesn't go away, then of course you must scratch it. But you should begin by observing the desire to scratch. When wanting to scratch, note wanting to scratch. When raising the hand, note raising. When moving it, note moving. When touching the itchy place, note touching, touching. When relieving the itch with every push and pull, note itching, itching, scratching, scratching. When bringing your hand back, note placing, placing. If the hand touches someplace, note touching, touching. After that, just return to observing rising, falling. Every time one changes position, it's just the same. One shouldn't miss a single tiny thing. Every time one adjusts one's position, one must observe in detail, starting with the desire to change. When one thinks about getting up from the sitting, one has to note the mind as wanting to stand, wanting to stand. When adjusting one's arms and legs, one must make the change by observing lifting, moving, stretching, touching, supporting, and so on in order. When the body leans forward, note leaning, leaning. When standing up, the body becomes light and rises up. One has to focus on this and note standing up, standing up. You should stand up slowly. It is said a person practicing meditation must behave like a weak invalid, although he or she is strong. When people who have normal health and strength stand up or walk, they do so easily. They move quickly with energy. But weak invalids move slowly and gently. Their movements are very gentle. When a person with a bad back stands up, he or she does so slowly and gently. Lest his back hurt, he holds himself gently and stands up gradually. It is said that in practicing meditation too, as the yogis are now, one must behave like those weak invalids. No matter what, one must change one's position slowly. Only when one moves slowly like this will mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom, sati, samadhi, and panya, rest on the object. For that reason, one has to move slowly from the start of the movement. One has to observe standing up, and stand up slowly like a sick person. Although healthy, one should move as slowly as a sick person, and that's not all. It is said that, although one has eyes to see, one must behave as though blind. Although one can hear, one must behave as though deaf. When one is meditating, one's job is just one thing, observing. Things beside this, like sights and sounds, are not one's concern. Therefore, no matter how extraordinary a sight might be, one must behave as if one doesn't see it, and just pay attention to noting the process of seeing. No matter how extraordinary a sound may be, one must behave as if one doesn't hear it, and just pay attention to observing the process of hearing. When one adjusts one's posture too, one must move gently and slowly, as weak or sick people do. All movements, such as moving the hand, the leg, bending, stretching, lowering the head, and looking up, must be done quietly and gently. Therefore, as now, when standing up from the sitting position, one must stand up slowly, observing standing up, standing up. After straightening up and coming to a standing position, note standing, standing. If you happen to look here or there, note looking, seeing, looking, seeing. When you walk, simply observe the step. When stepping with the right foot, note right step. When stepping with the left foot, note left step. You should come to know the gradual movements as they occur, starting with lifting the leg all the way to putting it down. Make one note for each step like this: right step, left step, right step, left step. This is how to note when walking fast. When walking quickly or going a long distance, it is enough just to make a single note for each step. It is enough to make a single note like this: left step, right step. But when moving slowly or doing walking meditation, there are 3 parts to observe with each step. One part is the lifting of the foot. Another part is moving it forward. And another part is putting it down. Out of these three parts, one should start with observing two parts, the lifting and the placing. Note the lifting of the foot as lifting. One should know the lifting precisely. After that, note the putting down as placing. One should know the gradual heaviness and downward movement precisely. One should start by observing these two parts, lifting, placing, lifting, placing. One should walk observing two parts for each step like this. After about 2 days, this two-part observation will become easy. When it becomes easy, one should observe three parts, lifting, moving, placing. Lifting, moving, placing. One should walk observing three parts like this. Now at the start of practice, it is enough to observe one part or two parts. When going quickly, observe one part per step like this, right step, left step. When walking slowly, one should walk observing two parts for each step, lifting and placing. When walking like this, if the desire to sit down arises, note wanting to sit, wanting to sit. When sitting down, the body gets heavy and goes down. You should focus on that action and note sitting down, sitting down. After one has sat down, there are still adjustments to the arms and legs. You should observe all of those. When there are no more adjustments to be made and the body is still, return to observing rising, falling, rising, falling. When observing like this, if stiffness and heat arise, one must observe them as well. Then return to observing the rising and falling. While one is observing like this, if one wants to lie down, note wanting to lie down, wanting to lie down. When one lies down to sleep, there are further adjustments to the arms and legs. One should observe all of those. When raising the arm, note lifting, lifting. When moving it, note moving, moving. When supporting oneself with the arm, note supporting, supporting. When the body leans forward, note leaning, leaning. When stretching out the legs, note stretching, stretching. When leaning over and lying down, note lying, lying, and lie down slowly. It is important to observe this process of lying down. During this time, too, special Dhamma insight can surely arise. When concentrated knowledge is strong, special Dhamma insight can occur at any time. It can occur even while bending or stretching. In the past, Venerable Ananda became an arahant just like this, while lying down. On the eve of the first Sangha Council, the Venerable Ananda was practicing strenuously in order to become an arahant in a single night. He practiced the form of mindfulness of the body, or Kaya Nupassana Satipatthana, called Kaya Gata Sati, doing walking meditation the entire night. It was just the same kind of observation as we have been speaking about, observing right step, left step, lifting, moving, placing. He contemplated the mental phenomena of wanting to walk and the physical process of walking, arising and passing away, one part after another part. Although it was nearly dawn, he had not yet reached arahantship yet. Then the Venerable Ananda, knowing that too much walking meditation could make the factor of effort or virya excessive, he thought to himself, in order to balance concentration, samadhi, and effort, virya, I'll meditate in the lying posture for a moment. He went into his room and sat down on the bed. After sitting down, he lay down. While he laid himself down in this way, noting lying down, just as we've been speaking about, he became an arahant. The Venerable Ananda was only a stream winner, sotapanna, before lying down. He practiced vipassana and went from being a sotapanna to realizing the state of once returner, or one who has realized Sakadagami path and fruition. From there he continued to meditate and realize the stage of a non-returner, or one who has realized Anagami path and fruition. And continuing to practice Vipassana, he realized the final stage, Arahata path and fruition. Thus, developing Vipassana and realizing the three upper levels of knowledge of path and fruition to become an Arahant took only a moment. It did not take long at all. It can happen at any moment. Just look at the way the Venerable Ananda became an Arahant. Therefore, you should make an effort to keep on observing at all times. You shouldn't slacken your observation thinking, this little bit is not very important. Thus, you should also observe faithfully at the time we just mentioned, when you lie down to sleep. When one is laying down, there are further adjustments to the legs and arms. You should observe all of these, too, without overlooking anything. When there is no more movement and the body is still, just return to observing rising, falling, rising, falling. Although it is night and time for sleep, you shouldn't let go of your noting and fall asleep. A person who really makes effort in the practice practices wholeheartedly, as if he or she were not going to sleep at all. Therefore, although it is night and time for sleep, you shouldn't stop noting. Just keep on observing without a break. Even while observing, you might fall asleep. When the observation gets the upper hand, one won't fall asleep. When sleepiness gets the upper hand, one will fall asleep. If you feel sleepy, note sleepy, sleepy. When the eyelids droop, note drooping, drooping. When they become heavy, note heavy, heavy. When the eyes sting, note stinging, stinging. While observing like this, the eyes may become clear again. In that case, note clear, clear. And then just return to observing rising and falling. However one may observe when one is truly sleepy, one will fall asleep. It is not hard to fall asleep, it is easy. After lying down, if one continues to observe, gradually the eyes droop and one falls asleep. Therefore, at the start of the practice, a yogi should not spend much time in lying posture. One should spend most of the time doing sitting and walking meditation. However, when it is night and the time comes to go to sleep, the yogi should note rising and falling while lying down. While observing like this, the yogi will naturally fall asleep. Sleep is the time when a yogi may rest. However, a yogi who is really striving in the practice should limit sleep to 4 hours. That is the middle watch of the night, the time permitted by the Buddha. If one sleeps about 4 hours, that is quite enough. If one doesn't think that 4 hours is enough for one's health, at the start of practice, a yogi can sleep up to 5 or 6 hours. 6 hours is clearly enough for good health. When waking up from sleep, one must start noting as soon as one awakens. A yogi who is truly striving to reach the path and fruition should only rest during the time of sleep. Except for this time, during one's waking hours, one should just observe without resting or stopping. Therefore, if one can observe it, one should note the waking mind as waking, waking. But if one can't observe and know this yet, one should just start with the rising and falling, noting rising, falling. When one thinks of getting up, note wanting to get up, wanting to get up. There will likely be changes in the position of one's arms and legs. One has to observe all of those too. When one lifts one's head up and rises, note getting up, getting up. When one comes into a sitting posture, note sitting, sitting. If there are further adjustments to the arms and legs, note all of these too. When there is no more movement and one is sitting still, simply observe rising, falling. Further, when washing one's face or taking a shower, one has to observe. Because these are actions one must perform rather quickly, One has to just observe what one can. There is also putting on one's clothes, making one's bed, and closing and opening the door. One must observe all of these carefully in detail. When eating, observe, starting with looking at your plate, noting looking, seeing, looking, seeing. Then observe all your actions, stretching out the hand towards the food, touching it, gathering the rice, making it into a ball, picking it up, bringing it into the mouth, bending the head down, putting the rice into one's mouth, putting the hand back down, and lifting the head back up. When chewing, note chewing, chewing, every time you chew. While chewing, when you taste the food, note tasting, tasting. And if you become pleased, note pleased, pleased. When it seems good, note good. When swallowing, note swallowing. If you can further observe the touch of the food going down the esophagus, note touching, touching. This is how to note while eating one bite of food. The next bites of food should be observed in just this way. When drinking soup also, there is looking and seeing, reaching, taking the spoon, dipping it into the soup, bringing it to the mouth, putting it into the mouth, swallowing. One needs to observe everything in this way. It is hard to observe while eating. There are many things to be noted. There are many things a person who is starting to meditate forgets to note or cannot observe. But one should have the attitude that, I will note everything. One can't help it if the mind skips over things because it can't observe them. Later, when concentrated knowledge becomes strong, one will be able to note everything in great detail. The ways to observe just mentioned are quite complete. But with such a detailed explanation, you may not be able to remember the basics to observe. Therefore, I will summarize them. In brief, there are just a few things to be observed. When walking, observe the movement of the leg stepping, right step, left step, right step, left step. Just those two things. When going fast, it is enough to note right step, left step, or right, left, once per each step. When going slowly, it is enough to note like this, lifting, placing, making 2 notes for each step. When sitting still, just observe these 2 things, rising, falling, falling. When one lies down, if there's nothing special to observe, just note rising, falling, falling. That's all. Therefore, there are just a few things to note, not many. While noting rising and falling, when there is thinking or the mind wanders, one has to observe these types of consciousness. Then return to observing the rising and falling. When there is stiffness, heat, pain, aches, and itchiness, observe those too. Then return to noting the rising and falling. During the sitting, if there's bending, stretching, movement, drooping the head, lifting up the head, leaning, swaying, and similar body movements, observe them and note them as they are. After observing and noting them, return to noting the rising and falling. While continuing to observe in this way, gradually what you're able to observe will increase. At the start, though, with the mind running here and there will be many objects that one fails to note properly. But one shouldn't be discouraged. No matter who it is, at the start of the practice, everyone experiences difficulties in observation like this. Later on, when one becomes skilled, one will be able to observe and know every time the mind wanders. Therefore, in time, the mind doesn't wander at all. It just remains fixed on the object of observation. As soon as there is rising, the mind knows and observes the rising, resting on it precisely. As soon as there is falling, the mind observes falling, resting on it precisely. with every observation. The object to be known and the knowing of it can occur together in a pair. These two, the physical object or matter to be observed, and the mind noting and knowing it, occur again and again in a pair. Where is there any person or being? There are just these two things, matter and mind, occurring together again and again. In time you will see this for yourself. As one observes rising, falling, one comes to distinguish between mind or nama and matter or rupa. The matter which rises or expands, and the mind which knows rising. Matter falling or collapsing, and the mind which knows falling. One will come to know for oneself mind and matter, occurring together one pair after another like this. Thus, in every observation there is the object of observation, rupa Dhamma or matter, and nama Dhamma or the mind, which notes and knows. One will come to know clearly with one's own knowledge that there are just these two things, mind and matter. This is the discernment of mind and matter, nama and rupa, called nama-rupa paracheta jnana. This is the very start of vipassana knowledge. It is important for this knowledge to arise correctly. After that, when continuing to observe, one comes to see cause and effect with one's own knowledge. This is called paccaya paragaha jnana. From this point, if one continues to observe, one will come to see and know with one's own knowledge how things arise and then pass away, moment by moment. Ordinary people think that the body exists from the time they were a child all the way up until adulthood. They think that the mind of their childhood exists all the way up until the present state of adulthood. They think that the mind and body are a single entity, I. In fact, it is not like this. There is not any permanently existing thing, Dhamma. Everything arises and then immediately passes away. You will only come to see this after you continue to observe for quite some time. When observing like this, when one sees how things disappear in a fleeting manner, one will come to understand that all things are impermanent. Coming to the understanding that all things are impermanent is anicca nupassana jnana. After that, one will come to perceive that merely due to arising and passing away, these things are unsatisfactory. That is called dukkha nupassana jnana. Further, one will experience many things in one's body which are difficult to bear. Because one experiences these things, one comes to perceive that the mind and body are just a big mass of suffering. This too is dukkha nupassana jnana. Further, none of the mind and matter one observes occur according to our wishes. Things arise and pass away according to their own nature. Through perceiving like this, one observes, one comes to realize that the mind and matter are uncontrollable. Not a person, not a self, just phenomena. That is called anatta nupassana jnana. When this knowledge of anicca, dukkha, and anatta are well developed, while one is observing in this way, one will realize nibbana. In the past, the Buddhas, Arhants, and noble ones who realized nibbana had to walk this very path of vipassana. Therefore, yogis who are now going to practice should consider that they have reached the great path of satipatthana vipassana, walked by the Buddhas, Arhants, and noble ones because they performed wholesome deeds, parami, making the aspiration, may I gain path, fruition, and nibbana. They should consider we are now on the great path of satipatthana vipassana, walked by the Buddhas, Arhants, and noble ones, because we have enough perfections, parami, to realize path, fruition, and nibbana in this very life. They should be happy. If one walks straight along this path, one will surely come to know for oneself the special knowledge built on concentration or insight knowledge, realized previously by the Buddhas, Arhants, and the noble ones. Before one has realized anything at all, one will gain concentration, stability of mind. Because of this concentration, samadhi, one will come to find special Dhamma, special tastes of the Dhamma, many things to be happy about, many good things. Further, one will come to know with one's very own knowledge, matter or physical phenomena, mind or mental phenomena, and the characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, or anicca, dukkha, and anatta. When these types of knowledge are fully developed, one will realize for oneself the Dhammas of path, fruition, and Nibbana realized by the Buddhas, Arhants, and Noble Ones. That doesn't take long. One can realize this within the time one is practicing now. One can realize this within a month or 20 days. One can also realize this within 15 days. Individuals with very exceptional parami can even realize this within 7 days. Therefore, one should have confidence that one is sure to realize the path, fruition, and Nibbana of the Buddhas, Arhants, and Noble Ones within these 15 days, 20 days, or 1 month. After realizing path knowledge, fruition knowledge, and Nibbana personally, you will become free of future existences in the states of loss, apaya, because of being free from the false view of the existence of a self, sakkaya ditthi, and skeptical doubt, vicikicca, which can cause rebirth in the states of loss. You should try having confidence that before long, in just these few days, you are sure to become free of the suffering of rebirth in the states of loss, apaya, which you would otherwise encounter throughout samsara. May you be able to practice making full effort, and with the knowledge of path and fruition, quickly realize the Dhamma of Nibbana, realized by the Buddhas and Noble Ones, Ariyas. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.